Hi everyone, and welcome back to my channel. We are currently talking about some of the slave trade acts that were enacted by Congress, and one of the things that we talked about was the Constitution, and it was Article 1, Section 9 of that Constitution that said that Congress wouldn't prohibit the migration or importation of people from another country to the United States. But what they did was enacted a Slave Trade Act of 1794 that had stiff penalties or restrictions for slavery from the United States to another country or region. And some of those penalties included a fine of $2,000, and even on board, if you had a slave and you were caught, you could get $200 fine or penalty per slave that was on the ship. So that was one of the Slave Trade Acts that they enacted. And we're also going to talk about the Slave Trade Act of 1800 and 1803. So if you hadn't watched the video of the Slave Trade Act of 1794, feel free to watch that before you watch this video. So now we're going to start with the Slave Trade Act of 1800. And I won't read all of it to you. I'll read some of it for you. And then if you want to read the rest of it, I'll leave a link below this video for this Slave Trade Act and another that we'll go over. But I just wanted to kind of go through it, point some things out, and explain that to you. So this one it's entitled "An Act in Addition to the Act entitled An Act to Prohibit the Carrying on the Slave Trade from the United States to any foreign place or country." So this one is in addition to the Slave Trade Act of 1794. So Section 1, be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America and Congress assembled, that it shall be unlawful for any citizen of the United States or other person residing within the United States, directly or indirectly, to hold or have any right or property in any vessel employed or made use of in the transportation or carrying of slaves from one foreign country or place to another. All right, so now this is actually saying that you can't own any property or any parts of any vessel or slave ship that's used to transport or carry slaves. Going on more, and any right or property belonging as foresaid shall be forfeited and may be libeled and condemned for the use of the person who shall sue for the same. And such person transgressing the prohibition aforesaid shall also forfeit and pay a sum of money equal to double the value of the right or property in such vessel which he held as aforesaid. So with this one, it's saying that whatever price or whatever holding that you had in a vessel, if you had, let's say, $1,000 worth or $2,000 worth, then you would have to pay double that. So you'd have to pay $2,000 if you own $1,000 worth, or $4,000 if you your part was worth $2,000 in any vessel. All right, Section 2, and be it further enacted that it shall be unlawful for any citizen of the United States or other person residing therein to serve on board any vessel of the United States employed or made use of in the transportation or carrying of slaves from one foreign country or place to another, and any such citizen or other person voluntarily serving as aforesaid shall be liable to be indicated thereof, and on conviction thereof shall be liable to a fine not exceeding $2,000 and be imprisoned not exceeding 2 years. Okay, so now you're adding more hefty fines to even having stock in a slave trade vessel. But for this one, if you're a citizen on board or you serve on board any United States vessel that deals with transportation or carrying of slaves, you can be fined up to $2,000 and you can be imprisoned for up to 2 years. Section 3, and be it further enacted that if any citizen of the United States shall voluntarily serve on board any foreign ship or vessel. So Section 2 was dealing with any United States vessel or ship. But this one is if you are actually volunteering or serving on a foreign ship, which shall hereafter be employed in the slave trade, he shall, on conviction thereof, be liable to and suffer the like forfeitures, pains, disabilities, and penalties as he would have incurred had such ship or vessel been owned or employed in whole or in part by any person or persons residing within the United States. So this is just continuing those penalties. If you were, once again, serving on a foreign ship that dealt with slaves or dealing with the trafficking of slaves, then you would still pay that up to $2,000 fine and up to 2 years in prison. And for the rest of it, I won't read section 4, 5, 6, or 7 to you. But if you wanted to go through and read those as well, feel free. But I just want to say that this is just adding two penalties that already existed with the Slave Trade Act of 1794, dealing with transportation of slaves. Next Slave Trade Act I want to read to you is the one from 1803, which was approved February 28th, 1803. And it's called an act to prevent the importation of certain persons into certain states where, by the laws thereof, their admission is prohibited. I see there were actually some states, even before 1803, that outlawed slavery. And some of those included Pennsylvania, there was Rhode Island, and I think maybe Connecticut. Those were some of the few. What Congress tried to do in this act, well, I just kind of read it first and let you see it. But Section 1 says, be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America and Congress assembled, that from and after the first day of April next, which is April 1st of this year, 1803, no master or captain of any ship or vessel or any other person shall import or bring or cause to be imported or brought any Negro, mulatto, or other person of color. And just to stop right there, this was the first act that actually introduced the language of Negro, mulatto, or person of color. So it was basically trying to group any person of color, whether they were Negro or mixed with Negro and European or whatever, or any person of color. So going back to reading it, any Negro or other person of color not being a native. So the only people of color, Negro, mulatto, or person of color that could be brought into the United States had to be a native of the United States, had to be a citizen or registered seaman of the United States. Or if that person was a seaman native of countries beyond the Cape of Good Hope. So the Cape of Good Hope is in South Africa. And for some reason, they didn't want anybody to be admitted into the United States if they weren't from beyond there. So if they didn't go past, well, what today is known as South Africa, and then going on up to Mozambique and Kenya, or what today are those borders, that if those people were mulatto, person of color, or Negro, and they didn't come from beyond those regions, then they couldn't be allowed to be admitted into the United States. For what reason they did that, I do not know. But just to keep reading, into any other port or place of the United States, which port or place shall be situated in any state which by law has prohibited or shall prohibit the admission or importation of such Negro, mulatto, or person of color, and if any captain or master of aforesaid or any other person shall import or bring or cause to be imported or brought into any of the ports or places aforesaid, any of the persons whose admission or importation is prohibited, as aforesaid, he shall forfeit and pay the sum of $1,000 for each and every Negro, mulatto, or other person of color aforesaid. So, long story short, again, if any Negro, mulatto, or other person of color was brought into any port that prohibited admission or importation of those people, except if that person of color was a native of, I guess, quote unquote, United States, if that person wasn't a citizen of the United States or registered seaman or beyond the Cape of Good Hope, if you brought any other person in the United States, I guess you could say places like West Africa. So things, related to West Africa, you could not bring those people into the United States. And if you did, you shall pay the sum of $1,000 for each and every Negro, mulatto, or other person of color aforesaid, brought or imported as aforesaid, to be sued for and recovered by action of debt in any court of the United States, one half thereof to the use of the United States, the other half to any person or persons prosecuting for the penalty, and in any action instituted for the recovery of the penalty aforesaid. The person or persons sued may be held to special bail, provided always that nothing contained in this act shall be construed to prohibit the admission of Indians. So, long story short, with that one, you could not disallow Indians to be imported. Also, any other person that was Negro, mulatto, or person of color, if they were prohibited, they could not be admitted. All right, section 2. And be it further enacted that no ship or vessel arriving in any of the said ports or places of the United States and having on board any Negro, mulatto, or person of color, not being a native, so there's that language again, that person had to be a native, a citizen, or registered seaman of the United States, or seamen natives of countries beyond the Cape of Good Hope, as aforesaid, shall be admitted to an entry. And if any such Negro, mulatto, or other person of color shall be landed from on board any ship or vessel in any of the ports or places aforesaid, or on the coast of any state prohibiting the admission or importation as aforesaid, the said ship or vessel, together with her tackle, apparel, and furniture, shall be forfeited to the United States. So, your ship, if you had any person on board that was admitted to the United States or brought to any port on the United States, that Negro, person of color, or mulatto, you basically have to forfeit your ship and everything on it, meaning your tackle on it, your apparel, furniture, everything shall be forfeited to the United States, and one half of the net proceeds of the such sales on such forfeiture shall inure and be paid over to such person or persons on whose information the seizure on such forfeiture shall be made. So whoever told on you would get part of that money. Section 3. And be it further enacted, and this is the last section, be it further enacted that it shall be the duty of the collectors and other officers of the customs and all other officers of the revenue of the United States in the several ports or places situated as aforesaid, to notice and be governed by the provisions of the laws now existing, or the several states prohibiting the admission or importation of any Negro, mulatto, or other person of color as aforesaid. And they are hereby enjoined vigilantly to carry into effect the said laws of said states, conformably to the provisions of this act, any law of the United States to the contrary notwithstanding. So with this one, it's basically saying that collectors or any officers of the court, the revenue of the United States, had to be aware of this law, and they had to make sure that they knew the rules or the laws of other states that prohibited the admission. They put the onus on certain people to make sure that this Slave Trade Act was actually followed through. So just to wrap it up, in this video, we talked about the Slave Trade Act of 1800 and the Slave Trade Act of 1803. And once again, if you haven't looked at the Slave Trade Act of 1794 in the previous video, feel free to watch that one. And there's one more Slave Trade Act that we want to look at, and it was the one of 1807, which was called the Act to Prohibit the Importation of Slaves. So we've gone through, or we're going to go through from the Constitution to the Slave Trade Act of 1794 that had certain prohibitions against certain people of color coming into the United States, or being brought into the United States, or being ships coming from the United States to deal in slave trade to any other country. Going through the Slave Trade Acts of 1800s and 1803, which also posed heavy penalties on people being caught dealing in slave trade, and adding new vocabulary with Negro, mulatto, or persons of color, and those distinctions, and gone through the Slave Trade Act of 1803, which added more distinctions, calling for Negroes, mulattoes, or persons of color, and also stipulations whether they had to be a native, they had to be a citizen, or from beyond the Cape of Good Hope in order to be imported into the United States. Any others were prohibited. And we're going to the Slave Trade Act of 1807, which is also, like I said, called the Act to Prohibit the Importation of Slaves, which cut off slave trade altogether. So I'll see you all in the next video.